The old inn stood at the edge of a forgotten road, its windows boarded up and its once proud sign now hanging by a single rusted chain. For years it had been nothing more than a local legend, a place where travelers disappeared, their screams swallowed by the wind. But to Daniel, a freelance journalist desperate for a story, the inn was an opportunity. He'd heard the rumors during a late-night bar crawl in a nearby town, a haunted inn abandoned in the 1940s after its owners vanished without a trace. Some said it was cursed, others claimed it was a portal to another realm. Either way, it was exactly the kind of story he needed to make a name for himself. Armed with a flashlight, a notebook, and his camera, Daniel arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the inn in a blood-red glow. The air was unnaturally still, the kind of silence that makes your ears ache. He pushed open the creaking front door, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the empty building. Inside the inn was a time capsule of decay, the wallpaper peeled in long, curling strips revealing the skeletal wood beneath. Dust coated every surface, and the air was thick with the smell of rot and mildew. A massive staircase dominated the foyer, its banister warped and splintered. Daniel set up his equipment on the front desk, his flashlight casting eerie shadows across the room. He flipped through his notes. The inn had 13 rooms, each one rumored to hold its own horrors. The local lore claimed that no one who entered room 13 ever came out alive. Perfect, he muttered, pulling out his camera. A feature on room 13 would practically write itself. As he explored, he took photographs of the crumbling architecture, the faded portraits lining the walls, and the grand, decrepit ballroom. The deeper he ventured, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The floorboards groaned beneath his weight, and the shadows seemed to stretch and shift as if alive. By the time he reached the second floor, the air had grown colder, his breath visible in thin puffs. The hallway stretched before him, its carpet moth-eaten and stained. Each door was numbered in tarnished brass, and at the far end, room 13 loomed like a specter. He hesitated for a moment, his fingers hovering over the door handle. The legends swirled in his mind, but he shook them off. "Just a story," he whispered, pushing the door open. The room was small and unremarkable. A single bed with a rotting mattress, a cracked mirror hanging above a wooden dresser, and a window covered in grime. But the air inside was heavy, almost suffocating. It felt as though the room itself was watching him. Daniel set up his camera on the dresser and began recording. He described the room, its ominous atmosphere, and the tales of those who had disappeared within its walls. As he spoke, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The shadows in the corner of the room seemed to thicken, coalescing into a darker mass. He paused, staring at the corner. "Hello?" he called, his voice barely above a whisper. The shadow didn't move, but the air grew colder. The door behind him slammed shut with a deafening bang, and the room was plunged into darkness. Daniel fumbled for his flashlight, his hands shaking. When he flicked it on, the beam illuminated the mirror. His reflection stared back at him, but it wasn't his reflection. The face in the mirror was older, haggard, and twisted with terror. Its lips moved, forming silent words. Daniel staggered back, his flashlight falling to the floor. The shadows in the corner began to writhe, creeping toward him like a living thing. Whispers filled the air, growing louder and more frantic. He couldn't understand the words, but they filled him with a primal fear. "Stop!" he screamed, pressing himself against the door. But it wouldn't budge. The shadows enveloped him, icy tendrils wrapping around his limbs. The whispers grew into a deafening roar, and the last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him was his reflection in the mirror, grinning. Weeks later, a group of urban explorers stumbled upon the inn. They found Daniel's camera on the dresser in room 13, still recording. The footage showed him talking about the room, his voice steady at first but growing increasingly frantic. The video ended abruptly, the camera knocked to the floor. But when they replayed the footage, they noticed something chilling. In the final frames, as the camera fell, the mirror reflected not just Daniel, but a dozen other figures, their faces contorted in agony. The explorers fled, leaving the camera behind. To this day, no one knows what happened to Daniel, or the countless others who entered room 13. The inn remains abandoned, its secrets locked away, waiting for the next unwitting soul to step inside. The Blackwell Library had stood for over 2 centuries, its towering spires and Gothic facade casting an ominous shadow over the town. Locals called it the Tomb of Knowledge, a nickname born not out of reverence but fear. Whispers spoke of a cursed room deep within its catacombs where no one dared enter twice. Yet for years it had remained sealed, and the stories faded into urban myth. Until Harold Greaves arrived. Harold wasn't like the rest of the town. He was a historian and archivist, a man who craved forgotten secrets and lost knowledge. When he learned that the library was seeking a new archivist, he leapt at the chance. The idea of combing through ancient untouched tomes thrilled him. From the moment he entered the library, Harold sensed its strange aura. The air was dense, heavy with the scent of old paper and damp stone. The towering shelves seemed to lean inward, as if conspiring to trap him. He found the librarian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Ashcroft, sitting at a desk by the entrance. Her thin fingers trembled as she handed him the keys. "Mrs. Ashcroft, there are rules, Mr. Greaves. The library closes at sunset. You must leave by then, always." "Harold, I'll keep that in mind." She didn't laugh. "Mrs. Ashcroft, and stay away from the sub-level archives. The door is locked for good reason." For the first few weeks, Harold respected the rules. He spent his days cataloging old manuscripts and repairing fragile books, his nights spent in a modest apartment nearby. The library's eerie atmosphere didn't bother him. If anything, it excited him. But curiosity has a way of eroding caution. One stormy evening, Harold lost track of time. He was immersed in a crumbling ledger from the 1700s, his desk lit by a dim desk lamp. The rain battered the library's stained glass windows, and the town bells struck 7 before he realized the hour. Mrs. Ashcroft was long gone, and the library was silent. Harold stood to gather his things when he noticed a faint light flickering from the stairwell that led to the sub-level archives. He froze. Mrs. Ashcroft's warning echoed in his mind, yet the historian in him couldn't resist. He grabbed his flashlight and descended the stairs, the wooden steps creaking under his weight. The sub-level archives were unlike anything he'd seen before. Rows of iron shelves stretched into the shadows, filled with books bound in cracked leather and parchment scrolls. The air was colder here, tinged with the metallic scent of old ink. At the center of the room stood a single ornate desk. On it lay an open book, its pages filled with writing that seemed to shift and shimmer in the dim light. Harold approached, his pulse quickening. The book was unlike any he'd ever seen. The title etched into its cover read the Libris Veritas. Curiosity overtook him and he reached out to touch the page. The moment his fingers brushed the paper, the room changed. The air grew oppressive, and the shadows seemed to ripple and move. The text on the page rearranged itself into words he could understand. "The knowledge you seek comes at a cost. Do you accept?" Harold. Sure, why not? But the shadows weren't done with him. The next morning, Harold woke at his desk, unsure how he'd gotten there. He felt drained, as if he hadn't slept at all. Brushing off the unease, he resumed his duties. Yet strange things began to happen. When he opened a book, the words would shift before his eyes, forming sentences that seemed to speak directly to him. At first, the messages were benign, trivial observations about his work. But as the days passed, they grew darker. You left the archives unlocked. The door creaked at midnight. Someone watches while you sleep. He tried to ignore them, but the whispers began. They would echo from the shelves, a cacophony of voices, soft yet insistent. They called his name, begged for help, screamed in agony. Mrs. Ashcroft noticed his deteriorating state. "Mrs. Ashcroft, you've been down there, haven't you?" "Harold, I don't know what you mean." "Mrs. Ashcroft, you've read from that book. It's bound to the Archivist now. You've brought it back to life." Before he could demand answers, she fled, slamming the library doors behind her. That night, Harold returned to the sub-level archives, determined to confront the Libris Veritas. The whispers guided him, growing louder with every step. When he reached the book, its pages turned on their own, revealing new words. "You have opened the door. The archivist must preserve the knowledge no matter the cost. Harold, what does that mean? The room answered with silence. Then the shadows moved. They rose from the floor, swirling into humanoid forms, their faces indistinct but filled with malice. Shadow 1, you took the oath. Harold, I didn't. Shadow 2, you read the book. The shadows surged forward, enveloping him in darkness. Pain shot through his body as their whispers pierced his mind. Visions of centuries past flooded his thoughts. Archivists before him, trapped in an endless cycle, each one consumed by the Libris Veritas. When Harold awoke, he was seated at the ornate desk. The Libris Veritas lay open before him, its pages filled with fresh text. His hands moved on their own, writing in a language he didn't recognize. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. He tried to stand, but his body wouldn't obey. He was bound to the desk, his fingers condemned to inscribe the book's endless knowledge. Years later, when the library reopened under new management, a young apprentice stumbled upon the sub-level archives. At the center of the room, she found an ornate desk and an old book filled with shifting text. Beside it sat a man, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow. "Apprentice, hello?" The man turned to her, his movements stiff. A voice not entirely his own answered, "Harold, do you seek knowledge?"